So the session I'm presenting today is about context for continuous experiences. As mentioned, I'm the Managing Director of Stripy SOC, a Canberra-based consultancy where we focus on mobile app development. And as mentioned, I've done a range of work for a number of public and private sector organisations. I guess one of our most recent apps that's been launched is we worked on, if anyone in the audience has children, we did the ABC Kids iView app, which was launched a couple of weeks ago. I know my 4-year-old loves it. We also actually did the work that Pia mentioned, an app that made use of the energy rating information on data.gov.au in her session, so we were the ones that did that app as well. But I've only got 25 minutes for this session, and in fact I want to allow 5 minutes for questions and answers at the end, so that really gives me 20 minutes in which to cover the content. So enough about me, let me move on to what I wanted to talk about today. And really I want to focus on just two things. I've been a little bit overwhelmed today at the breadth of the content that has been covered. The Internet of Things is huge, and what it potentially enables is huge as well. So this is, I guess, having heard a lot about the big picture down to now looking at two very small detailed bits to perhaps provide some more concrete examples of the sort of experiences that can be enabled by a little bit of additional information about the context in which people are using mobile devices and interacting with internet-based services. So the two things I want to talk about, firstly, I want to talk about how we use context, or how we use information about the context in which an app's being used in some of the applications that we've worked on. And I'm going to do that by focusing on one case study, which is an application we're building at the moment for the National Portrait Gallery here in Canberra. After that, I want to talk about how I think you, as people from government, could use this same sort of approach. So I'm going to do that by talking about one hypothetical scenario where you might be able to make use of the same sort of information about the context in which people are using apps to provide a more seamless experience for citizens who have to interact with government services. So first I want to start by talking about context. So we've heard from previous speakers a little bit about how the proliferation of connected devices with ever decreasing cost and increasing compute power, increasing number of sensors, offers the possibility of providing us with more context about lots of things. But what can we do with that context? So I've got this way of thinking of it in terms of a little formula, which basically says if you've got some context and you make some assumptions, then you get some sense of what a person's intent might be at a given point in time. And so I'm thinking about this when I'm building a mobile application. If you've got a small bit of context represented by the blue circle up there, then you end up having to make a fairly large number of assumptions. And even then, you end up with a high degree of uncertainty about what the user's intent is. If you increase the amount of context that you've got available, then you can decrease the number of assumptions you need to make. And perhaps you can arrive at a fairly decent estimation of what someone's intent might be. But what's the point of that? Why would you be interested in trying to understand someone's intent when they're using a mobile app, for example? Well, consider a scenario where you're visiting an art gallery. And the gallery has available to you an app you can use on your phone to find out more about the artworks on display in the gallery. So you've walked in and you've seen a painting that you're really interested in, and you want to find out more about it. Without any understanding of what your intent is, if the app on the phone doesn't know that you're interested in a particular painting, then you might end up with a user interface a little bit like this, where the painting might have a little number next to it to tell you what number painting it is, and you punch that number into your keypad to tell the app that's the painting I want to know about, and then you get some information back. And there's nothing wrong with that experience. It's fine. It's actually really flexible. It doesn't take a lot to punch in a number on a screen. But is there a way that we can improve this experience, provide something that's a little bit more seamless by understanding more about your intent using the app? What if, for example, you could just walk up to the portrait and by virtue of being near to it, the app knew that your intent was you wanted to find out about that. So the context there is that you're close to it. The assumption is you're probably interested in something that you're close to. And the guess of what your intent is as a user, I want to find out about this portrait that I'm standing next to. So this is what we've done in our app for the National Portrait Gallery. But the question is, how does it work? Well, you might not be surprised to know it's all powered by the magic of the Internet of Things. That's why we're here today, isn't it? Actually, not the Internet of Things at all, but really just one thing. So again, as I said in my introduction, I'm sort of focusing on one specific example. The Internet of Things is huge. There are so many things that have sensors, have internet connectivity, can provide information about physical objects in the world. We're probably using one of the simplest. And what it is a Bluetooth low-energy beacon. Apple's been marketing them under the brand name of iBeacon. Basically, what it is a tiny, you can get them about that big. The ones we're using are a little bit larger so they can accommodate more batteries. But it's basically a little Bluetooth radio transmitter. And all it does is transmits a unique identifier. These devices can transmit their identifier many times a second over the course of about 2 years on a single battery that they ship with. And that's as simple as the device is. It doesn't actually have any other network connectivity. It just sends its ID to anything that's within radio range of it that can then receive that ID and act on it. But it turns out that this really simple idea enables a whole lot of different experiences because it provides just a tiny bit more context to an app. Suddenly, if I have an app installed on my phone and I'm in an art gallery, my phone can detect a signal coming from a beacon. So it can detect the unique ID that's being transmitted and also knows the strength with which that signal is being received. And that strength gives you a pretty good estimate of your proximity to the beacon transmitting the signal. So imagine then, instead of just one of these, imagine you've got one next to every painting in the gallery. Now you're in a situation where you could walk around and your phone will know which painting you're near and you can get information about it. Unfortunately, it's not quite as simple as that. It turns out having lots of little radio transmitters all transmitting on the same frequency in a small space can be a bit problematic. The signals can tend to sort of get a bit noisy. The signals fluctuate a bit, so a transmitter transmitting from a certain distance, the strength with which you receive the signal gives you an idea about how close you are, but you might be standing still and suddenly someone will walk between you and the transmitter and the signal will drop a bit. And if you're not careful and you're making too many assumptions, you might think, oh, the user's moved away, but really it's just that there's noise in the signal. So what we've ended up with is a variety of configurations. This involved a lot of testing of positioning beacons and measuring the signal we were receiving and trying out different things. Here's one sort of configuration where there's a gallery space that's divided sort of into two halves with an internal wall. And we could place a beacon on either side of that wall with a directional antenna pointing away from the wall. So we could tell with quite a high degree of reliability which side of the wall you're on, and therefore show you information about the portraits that are in the same half of the room that you're currently in. But it's still not that simple. It's actually worse than that as well. In my formula I put up on the screen before, I had context plus assumptions equals intent. That term assumptions is really important because what about this scenario? Imagine we've got the context about where you're standing sorted. Just imagine the technology works well enough that we can precisely locate you at this point in the room. Which painting are you interested in? Is it the three that are closest to you? Or did you just walk in and on the far side of the room there's a really large portrait that's caught your eye and you're really interested in it and you've looked down at your phone to see if you can find out more about it as you walk across? So should we in fact give you information about everything that's in your line of sight? Or what if you were looking for a particular portrait and the gallery staff said, yes, that's in gallery 5, you'll find it in there, and you've walked in and it turns out to be the one that's behind the other internal wall that you can't see? That would be a frustrating experience if you referred to your phone and it was only showing you information about the portraits in line of sight, because you'd say, well, they've sent me on a goose chase here, that portrait's not there. So I guess the lesson we learnt in deploying this application was that whilst these beacons and devices like them can provide you with greater context about how the app's being used, and that can mean that you can make fewer assumptions, it's still really important to recognise where you're making assumptions and to ask whether they're relevant or not. So what we settled with, this is the app. It's not in the App Store yet. We're still in the final stages of finishing it. Basically, when you launch it on your phone, it will tell you that it's capable of showing you information about portraits nearby and seek your permission to use location services on your phone to enable that. If you agree, you can then get through and see the portraits. You can actually just scroll through this list of portraits because we recognise that a majority of people that install it are probably not physically at the gallery. They might have just downloaded it from the App Store at home and be interested in finding out more about the portraits in the National Portrait Gallery's collection. But if you are at the gallery, it'll detect the beacons, and we've basically settled on the idea of using beacons to determine which of the 7 gallery spaces you're in, and not trying to narrow it down any more than that, for the 2 reasons that I described in terms of the difficulty in pinpointing a location with lots of noisy signals and signals that are affected by interference, and also the difficulty in then translating that sense of where you are into what are you going to be interested in. So it ends up with an interface where you can see all of the portraits that are in the same gallery space as you, and you just tap on one to find out more. And then as you move to a different portrait, different gallery space, you'd see a different range of portraits. Now this is kind of similar to that interface I showed at the beginning, where there was just a numeric keypad. But instead of having to sort of peer at the label and find the number and type it in, you just look at the portrait and see it on the screen and tap it. It's incrementally a better experience. But what if there was another way that we could allow users to express their intent even more clearly? How about pointing at a portrait and say, that's the one I want to know about? Well, it turns out that these devices, as well as having the ability to receive Bluetooth radio communications, have a whole heap of sensors in them as well. There's a gyroscope which will tell you what direction the device is being held in, and there's an accelerometer that tells you how much it's moving, and there's a camera that will give you images. So we've combined all of these, and if you walk into the gallery and you hold the device vertically, whoops, don't do that while you're trying to drive your presentation. If you hold your device vertically. The gyroscope will recognise that the device is vertical and will trigger image recognition. So we'll use the camera to recognise what it is that you're looking at. So if you point it here at a portrait of Harry Kuehl, it'll retrieve the information about that portrait. So we've kind of got these different modes of allowing the user to either allowing the app to sort of infer the user's intent. You're in this gallery space, therefore you're likely to be interested in the information about one of these portraits, here they are, or allow users to be a bit more explicit about their intent. Hold the device up to a particular portrait and it'll retrieve information about that one. So that's that's a bit about what we've been doing with that extra information about the context that the app's being used in that's provided by these Bluetooth beacons. And what I've focused on there is what that enables for a user of the app. We've heard in other presentations about the sorts of things that this context can provide beyond just for an individual user though as well. So, the question is, what else can this understanding of the context in where the app's being used enable for the visitor or for the gallery? So Dan from the Geospatial SIG earlier on talked about visitor analytics. This could be used for the same sort of thing. The system I've described here, the app on the user's device knows where in the gallery it's being used. It can send that information back to a back-end system that can then log that, and you can then derive analytics about what are visitors' paths through the gallery, which gallery spaces do they go and spend most of their time in. And you can think of different uses of that. For the gallery, they might be really interested in that in terms of understanding how they plan their collection. They move it around, which parts are the most popular. For an individual, I don't know whether this is a good idea or not, but potentially the app knows which portrait you spent the most of the time looking at. Maybe after your visit, the gallery could send you a postcard saying, thanks for coming, hope you enjoyed it. And it could be a postcard that has the portrait you spent most of your time looking at. Could be a bit creepy, or it could be really nice. Just to be clear, in the current version, we're not actually logging where people are, but the technology allows is can be used for those sorts of things. So that ends the first part, and now I want to talk about the second thing, which is talking about how I think government could potentially use this sort of technology to enable more seamless, continuous experiences. So why is this important? I think hearing from Simon from Uber earlier was really great, because it gave us all insight into what people's expectations are of services. Uber is setting people's expectations. Other apps like Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, the things people use from day to day on their devices are setting their expectations. Uber allows you to, get at your phone, tap a button, and a car will arrive and pick you up and take you where you want to go. That's pretty seamless. And now people expect that from everyone. People expect that from all the businesses they interact with. People expect it from interactions with the government as well. So how can we use the context provided by things like iBeacons to create more seamless experiences? Here's the scenario. Imagine I need to interact with Centrelink as an example. I need to talk to someone about a payment I'm receiving. I might pick up the telephone, call a Centrelink call centre, organise a time to see someone, and then subsequently go into a Centrelink office. And I'd probably get there and have to line up for a little while. And then I'd eventually get to the front of the line. I'd talk to someone behind a counter and say, yes, my name's Jake. I called, I've made an appointment to see someone to talk about a payment I'm receiving, and I need some advice on it. And they'd say, okay, take a seat. We'll let you know when the person that you've booked an appointment with is ready for you. And I'd sit down for a while. And then I'd get to see the person. So again, there's nothing really wrong with this. I still get to talk to the person I need to talk to. But as I was alluding to, people's sort of expectations have changed a bit about these sorts of experiences. So I'd like to propose an alternative that makes use of iBeacons and smartphone apps to create a more seamless experience. So it might start in the same way. I've made a phone call to say I need to see someone. And whilst I'm on the phone, the person I'm talking to enters that information about my appointment into the Centrelink information system, and it sends a push notification to my device. So it displays a notification on my lock screen to say, your appointment is 10 a.m. tomorrow. Slide to read, and I just swipe on my lock screen. I don't even need to launch the app, and there's a button I can say add to calendar, so I tap that, and I've got that appointment now in my calendar, and I'll get a reminder when it's time to go to that appointment. Interesting information about what these devices do with context. You may not have realised, but on iOS at least, there's this thing called location services, and by default, it will keep track of the locations you visit in a regular basis. It'll look at appointments in your calendar. It'll know where you are at a particular time. So by virtue of adding that to my calendar, the following day, if I look at the lock screen on my phone, it'll say your first appointment's at Centrelink in Braddon. It'll take about 36 minutes to get there in current traffic. And that traffic information is up to date because they collect information from people's regular commutes from where I live to Braddon, and they know that today, the people that made that trip just a moment ago are taking typically longer than they would normally take, so it's a bit slower, so they can then use that information to tell me that my commute is going to be slower. I didn't need to do any of that, it's just what the system does. Okay, so I'm on my way to Centrelink, and as I arrive in time for my appointment, I walking through the door of the building, and I come within range of a beacon. The app that's installed on my phone is launched into the background, so I don't need to actually get the phone out of my pocket or anything. It detects the signal from the beacon, and it can detect the identifier for it, so it knows it's the beacon at Centrelink Braddon. It knows who I am because I've previously logged into my Centrelink app on my phone, and it knows that I've got an appointment today because it retrieves that information from the Centrelink information system. So it can then display a little dialogue on my screen to say, welcome to Centrelink Braddon, your appointment's coming up, slide to check in. And then again, I can just unlock my phone, and I've got an explicit action where I can say, okay, I want to notify Centrelink that I'm here. So this sort of addresses privacy concerns that my device isn't going to send data about my location without me making an action. So the context is my device knows that I'm close to the place where I have an appointment, and it uses that information to provide me with a way of saying, yes, I want to tell them that I'm here. I tap on that, and maybe a little light on the desk of the person who I've come to meet might flash to let them know that their next appointment is ready and they could get up and come out and greet me. So just recapping on the two things again that I wanted to talk about. context. So Internet of Things allows us to understand more about the context in which people's interactions with smartphones and things like that are happening. That can allow us to make fewer assumptions and still be able to understand what someone's intent is. And by understanding their intent, we can design experiences that are just a little bit nicer for people. And I think that allows us to bridge the gap between the interaction you have with your smartphone and the interaction you have with a person in the physical world. To me, that's the real promise of the Internet of Things, is this possibility of making things a little bit more continuous, and rather than having quite separate interactions where I'm interacting with my smartphone, or I'm sitting down and interacting with a website, or I'm talking on the phone, or I'm talking to a person, we can get a little bit more about the context and start to bring all of these things together into a more continuous experience. So thank you very much for that. I do have 5 minutes left now for questions and answers, if there are any questions.
Thank you very much, Jake. Are there any questions? And please remember that we'd like the microphone to reach you before. Gentleman here on the left, sorry about.
Jake, thank you for your presentation. It's great to have the context of Internet of Things in a public sector sense. A number of the governments I speak to are often interested in scale. I just wonder whether you had some remarks to make about, even in these examples or other projects, about how you deliver scale, and is that important for these government entities you work with?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And obviously for something even like the example I proposed of Centrelink officers, there's lots of them. And the question of scale would be, how do you actually manage having more fixed infrastructure basically in all of these locations. And that's, I think, a real challenge, is that we hear about how these sorts of sensors and devices are getting smaller and more low powered and able to run for longer periods of time. But there still is an overhead involved with just managing the logistics around, okay, let's install radio transmitters in all of these buildings, and who's going to actually install them, and who's going to keep track of when the batteries need changing, and how are you going to deploy it at that scale. I don't know what the answer is, unfortunately. One of the projects I did was with the National Gallery in their sculpture garden, and one of the ways in which we addressed that challenge of the infrastructure was to try and reuse existing infrastructure as much as possible. So that example, we wanted to do something in the sculpture garden which is outside. So we kind of needed a way of installing these transmitters throughout the garden, kind of evenly placed, so that we can have a good coverage in weatherproof enclosures where we would be able to find them again later. And so we thought, we could go and dig a whole heap of holes and install new things, or we could reuse something that's there. So we identified light fixtures as something that was already pretty well spread through the garden, because you need to provide light wherever you are, already pretty weatherproof. So we're able to actually install beacons within the existing light fixtures. And I kind of think that for this to get adopted at a bigger scale, it might need to be things like LED light bulbs might actually all come with Bluetooth radio transmitters as well. So every light bulb will become a beacon, and there won't be any extra overhead of having them. It's just, your existing management of lights would allow you to have that infrastructure in place, and then it becomes thinking about how to make use of that information. Any other questions?
Any other questions? Lady in the centre, please.
Thanks, Jake. That was very interesting. I really liked the app for the portrait gallery.
Thanks.
Just a question around if, for me as a user, that app would be really useful for exhibitions and when they have special things on. But the galleries seem to have a policy that there's no taking photos.
Not anymore.
They dropped that.
They did.
Great.
During this project, coincidentally.
Changed behaviour.
Yeah.
Good.
But that's it's a good question. And I think galleries generally are struggling with this. I mean, the policies around no photography are for two main reasons. One is like flash photography can cause damage to sensitive old portraits and things like that. And also copyright issues if people are taking photographs, are the gallery complicit in the artist's copyright being breached? I think that most galleries are starting to just realise that people carry cameras with them everywhere they go and take photos of everything these days. And if you ask, particularly when, say, school groups are visiting, if you want people to be interested in this, you need to let them interact with it as they would the other things that they're interested in life. So thankfully, that hasn't been a problem this time around.
Time for one more question. The lady at the very far at the back.
Hi, I'm Flora Salim from Computer Science in RMIT. I wonder if you consider multiple contexts in your applications and dynamic contexts if, let's say, the context change in real time. And it seems that you only mainly consider location, but yeah, what are the other types of contexts you've been considering?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I really admire apps that do take account of multiple contexts and changing contexts. One of the ones that I think is quite clever is the built-in navigation app on iOS. If you're driving your car and you ask for directions, it'll give you driving directions. And then if you stop your car and you get out and you start walking, it'll switch to giving you walking directions because it's noticed from the accelerometer that your movement has changed from movement that feels like driving to movement that feels like walking. We've looked for opportunities to do things like that. So I guess where we've made best use of multiple contexts is in trying to solve the problem of noisy signals from the beacons. We're actually using the other sensors in the device to try and counter that. So as example I said before, you could be standing stationary and the signal you're receiving from beacons in your environment is fluctuating, which might suggest you're moving. But if the app then refers to the accelerometer data that says actually the accelerometer says the phone's still, then we can sort of disregard the fluctuations. So it's a little bit of trying to switch together the information you get from the different sensors to validate the information you're getting from others. Yeah. I think we could do more with it though as well.